This speech from Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau is from March 8th, but I just found it and I think you need to see this, especially if you opposed Motion M103. It might not sound like much at first, but after a little while he really lets loose and it's incredible.
On Islamophobia.
Oh boy.
We have been seeing over the past while a rise in expressions of hate and in hate crimes across the country.
Okay, expressions of hate and hate crimes are very different things. Saying to someone, I hate you, I think what you think is bad, I think how you act is bad, is a hell of a lot different from vandalizing their house and killing them. Let's just be careful to distinguish that from the start.
Yesterday, we had an attack on a mosque in Calgary, but we also had attacks on the Jewish community in the GTA.
I have no idea what you're talking about with the mosque attack in Calgary. You gave this speech on March 8th, so you must mean there was an attack on March 7th. And yet, there's nothing in the news about that. At all. Normally that kind of stuff makes the news, especially when Islamophobia is such a popular subject. So, if it wasn't even enough to make the news, I have to question how severe this attack really was, or indeed if anything happened at all. And as for the attacks on the Jewish community in Toronto, maybe you mean the bomb threats to 2 Jewish community centers? And I guess you could consider that an attack, but when you use words like attack, you make it sound like people are literally coming in and attacking. Let's just tone it down a little, okay?
We have examples of racism, intolerance, and hatred spiking up all across the country over the past months.
Okay, well, that sucks, I guess, but racism, intolerance, and hatred are not the same as crimes.
Obviously, the terrible terrorist attack in Quebec City was an example of it, was a particularly brutal example of it, but we have an awful lot more to do.
The attack on the mosque in Quebec City was an example of a terrorist attack, a mass murder. That is something that it's the government's responsibility to deal with. And it was motivated by hatred, and yet it's still not the same thing as racism, intolerance, and hatred. Those are opinions people hold, and which the government is not responsible for stamping out. And that's why that very last statement bothers me.
But we have an awful lot more to do.
Do you? Do you really? What more do you have to do? The killer was arrested and charged. In fact, in the case of any crime, the police try to arrest and charge the perpetrator. It seems to me that you're doing everything you're supposed to do. And it seems to me that anything more would involve reaching beyond your responsibility and trying to control people's minds, which is not your job. The murderer, Bissonnette, held opinions which you and I find distasteful, and yet which many other nonviolent people hold. Just the same as how Muslim terrorists hold opinions which I find distasteful, and yet which many nonviolent Muslims also hold. The difference is that the Quebec City terrorist and the Muslim terrorists act out violently based on their ideas. But that does not imply that it's the government's job to try to wipe racism or Islamophobia or Islam from society. The Quran preaches that atheists and polytheists are subhuman filth, but it's not the government's job to reach into mosques and deconvert Muslims. And similarly, it's not your job to deconvert anyone else from any opinion they might hold. You can monitor them if you think that they might be inciting violence or planning to commit it, and if they do either of those things, then arrest and charge them. But that's it. And I know it sounds like I might be interpreting too much into what Justin is saying so far, but just keep watching, you'll see that I'm not.
It may reassure you to know that last fall, this House, unanimously, every member in this House, approved of a motion condemning Islamophobia.
Yes, and that too was a result of petition E411, just like M103 is. Here's the video.
Mr. Speaker, in a moment I'll be seeking unanimous consent for an important motion based on the e-petition sponsored by the Honourable Member for Pierrefonds-Dollard that asks that we, the House of Commons, condemn all forms of Islamophobia. C'est une pétition non partisane qui a été signée par plus de 66 000 Canadiens. Following discussions with all parties in the House, I believe you will find consent for the following motion. Que la Chambre se joigne aux plus de 66 000 Canadiens et Canadiennes qui ont appuyé la pétition électronique de la Chambre des communes E411 condamnant toute forme d'islamophobie, that the House join the more than 66,000 Canadian supporters of House of Commons e-petition E411 in condemning all forms of Islamophobia.
L'honorable député a-t-il le consentement unanime de la Chambre afin de proposer la motion? Non, il n'y a pas de consentement unanime.
Oh, never mind. That was the first time they tried, on October 5th when they failed. Here's the video of them trying to pass the exact same motion again, because if it doesn't work the first time, just keep trying until it does, right?
Following discussions with all parties in the House, I hope you will find consent for the following motion. That the House join the 69,742 Canadian supporters of House of Commons e-petition E411 in condemning all forms of Islamophobia, que la Chambre se joigne aux 69 742 Canadiens et Canadiennes qui ont appuyé la pétition électronique de la Chambre des communes E411 condamnant toute forme d'islamophobie. Oui.
L'honorable député a-t-il le consentement unanime de la Chambre afin de proposer la motion? La Chambre a entendu l'énoncé de la motion. Plaît-il à la Chambre d'adopter cette motion? Adopté.
Notice that he says all forms of Islamophobia.
In condemning all forms of Islamophobia.
Which people are going to take to mean these. Now, that motion was adopted on October 26, 2016. M103 is not new because it condemns Islamophobia. It's just new in its declaration of the government's intent to eliminate thoughts the government deems Islamophobic from society, and in its call for government action.
It was unanimously approved. That was a good measure.
No, it really wasn't, because Islamophobia does not mean anti-Muslim hate crimes. It means any thought or word that anyone calls Islamophobic, which is a hell of a lot. It's like you people never leave your little fucking bubble and go out on the streets in the towns and communities of Canada and see how people actually use these terms in the real world.
It was a moment where everyone came together and agreed. It was a motion by Mr. Mulcair, and we were glad to have this House condemn Islamophobia.
Yeah, crazy, isn't it? What the hell happened, Conservatives? Did you fall asleep? Well, at least you tried to make up for it with M103, I guess.
More recently, when a motion came forward to not just condemn Islamophobia, but to ask the House of Commons committee to study it.
Which will probably be pretty confusing for them, since you refuse to define it for them.
To get into the issues around it and to see what we can do in a very open way about moving forward on something that is unfortunately increasing in terms of intolerance.
Oh, I see. Okay. So you want to control the opinions of the Canadian people in a very open way. Well, that's all right then. Hey, you remember when you said this?
Canadian liberty compels us to resist the urge to impose our personal beliefs upon our fellow citizens. It has created a bit of a debate.
Yes, because you want to use a term with many very different meanings, including the criticism of one particular religion, leave its definition as broad as you possibly can, and then try to eliminate any thoughts that you, the government, decide match it. The motion says you want to eliminate it. If there's anything that should provoke a debate, that's it.
And on one hand, I'd like to think that everyone can all get up and always condemn things that are bad and move on. But on the other hand, sometimes it's useful for people to stand up and disagree.
Yes, to point out to the rest of you that there's still a lot of work to do. If you want to ensure the motion has a clear and unambiguous wording which respects the fact that it is not the government's place to modify the thoughts of the people. If everyone had just agreed and you'd moved on, maybe you wouldn't be addressing the very scary and real spike in honest expressions of opinions or even of facts being labeled Islamophobic hate speech. Maybe you wouldn't be challenging each other as politicians, in the things that you're saying, in the choices you make, as leaders, to play up divisions and fears. It's easy to try and scare and shame people into supporting your motion. It's easy to write a bad motion that's going to pit a neighbor against a neighbor because you refuse to clarify or modify it and then hurl insults when people object. And if you do it in a sneaky way and use coded language, like Islamophobia, maybe you won't get called on it by the majority. Maybe you'll get to slip it through.
But on the other hand, sometimes it's useful for people to stand up and disagree, to point out to the rest of us that there's still a lot of work to do.
Oh, never mind. You're Justin Trudeau. Of course you think the reason it's useful for people to disagree with M103 is that they show you that you really do have a lot of work to do. Hey, how did all these people who disagree with me get in my house? Clearly I have a lot of work to do if I want to get rid of their Islamophobic bigotry.
If everyone had just agreed and we'd moved on, maybe we wouldn't be addressing the very scary and real spike in hate speech.
That sentence feels really familiar. Anyway, yeah, when you start reclassifying all full-throated opposition to an idea as hate speech, that'll tend to cause a spike in hate speech. By the way, you remember when you said this in 2015?
Fear is a dangerous thing. Once it is sanctioned by the state, there is no telling where it might lead. It is always a short path to walk from being suspicious of our fellow citizens to taking actions to restrict their liberty.
And yet here you are in current year, Mr. Prime Minister, attempting to incite fear of words, just like you said you shouldn't. You even used the word scary for extra impact.
Maybe we wouldn't be challenging each other as politicians in the things that we're saying, in the choices we make as leaders to play up divisions and fears.
This is weird, man. Why are you copying what I said earlier? But I have always wondered that, Justin. Why do you play up divisions and fears? You just played up hate speech fears in the previous sentence, and here's you in that same 2015 speech, playing up divisions and fears by encouraging Canadians to be fearful that their government was encouraging them to be fearful.
Across Canada, and especially in my home province, Canadians are being encouraged by their government to be fearful of one another. For me, it is both unconscionable and a real threat to Canadian liberty.
And now, after being elected, here you are in 2017, encouraging Canadians to be fearful of each other. Awesome. Good job, man. You're really living up to the example of Stephen Harper, who you were complaining about in that speech. You were excoriating your predecessor for fear-mongering, but you're saying the same kind of fear-mongering bullshit now that you were complaining about him saying then, all while trying to pretend that it's only the Conservatives doing it now. You've literally become the terrifying version of Stephen Harper that you portrayed in 2015. And you know what? Fine. I expect fear-mongering from a politician, and to be honest, if you see a trend that you genuinely find scary, I think that as an individual Canadian citizen who wants the best for your country, it's not a bad idea to try to show people why it's scary. Just while you do it, don't pretend you're so special or so different from anyone else, you hypocrite. Now, aside from you personally, all the Liberal Party, your party, has done with this motion, M103, is divide people against one another, just like you're complaining about. You refuse to make even the slightest compromise, to the extent that you refuse to even clarify the wording to say anti-Muslim religious discrimination instead of, or even alongside, Islamophobia. And then you had people in your party publicly, on television and Twitter and so on, hurling insults at anyone who requested that change.
Leading this country should mean you bring Canadians together. You do not divide them against one another.
If you knew people in your party were doing this kind of thing, why didn't you say something and put a stop to it? The answer will become blindingly obvious throughout the course of this video.
It's easy to try and scare people into voting for you.
Oh, I know. You hardly seem to exert any effort at all. And it worked.
It's easy to try and say something that's going to pit a neighbor against a neighbor.
Yeah, look how easy it was for you to say, hey, it's good when the bigots who oppose us refuse to condemn bad things and debate us instead, because then we can see how much work we have left to do in dealing with them. That didn't pit neighbor against neighbor at all, did it? That doesn't divide Canadians along those lines, does it, Justin?
And if you do it in a sneaky way and use coded language, maybe you won't get called on it by the majority.
Which of course is why you accepted the Conservatives' proposed revision of the motion with the clearly decoded language of discrimination against Muslims, instead of stubbornly insisting on not only using the coded language of Islamophobia, but also on providing no definition in the text of the motion at all. And why your party's representative on television certainly did not call the Conservatives cynical.
It was quite a cynical attempt to find resolve within the Conservative Party on the issue regarding the Muslim community.
Or make fun of people who object to your use of coded language by calling them all scaredy cats, and then accusing them of contributing to the problem of discrimination because they're directly naming that problem instead of using your sneaky coded language.
But so the problem with the Conservatives right now is that they're scared of using the term. And so it doesn't mean because you're not using the term that actually it doesn't exist. And basically by not using the term, you're contributing to the problem.
And then tell people not to focus on the fact that you're acting in a very sneaky way, using coded language, because this is about more than words.
Terry, this is more than words.
No, she certainly didn't do that, and you're certainly not pulling the same bullshit now. Nope, not at all. Only an evil, cynical conservative would do that.
Well, if M103, condemning Islamophobia, actually gets people to notice that there are people uncomfortable with that idea, that there are people who still have problems with the idea that we would condemn discrimination against Muslims, then we have to know. We have to expose that, and we have to deal with it as a society.
What are you, the fucking Witchfinder General? Listen to you. Okay, let me try to unpack that goddamn mess. So let's remember what it is you're bitching about here. You're upset that the Conservatives in the House of Commons disagree with you about M103. You don't like their objections to its wording or their proposed changes. And because they don't like it exactly the way you do, you're now accusing all of them, not to mention all the Canadians who agree with them, of having a problem with the idea that the government would condemn discrimination against Muslims. But you'll recall that the main group of people who objected to condemning discrimination against Muslims were the supporters of your preferred wording of M103. Your version of the motion does not say that you condemn discrimination against Muslims. The Conservatives' version literally said discrimination of Muslims, which is nowhere present in your version. And all of the substance of your motion, aside from that, is still present in their version. So they agreed with you on everything. They just wanted clarity of wording. And yet, despite this, you now accuse them of having a problem with condemning discrimination against Muslims, even while at the exact same moment, you're arguing that this motion must not say that you condemn discrimination against Muslims. Your hypocrisy makes me sick. And now you're saying if there are people who would rather condemn discrimination against Muslims instead of using your sneaky code word Islamophobia, or if there are people who want the government to actually do its fucking job instead of standing around making moral proclamations about which thoughts are okay for its citizens to hold, we have to know. We have to expose it and deal with it as a society.
Then we have to know. We have to expose that, and we have to deal with it as a society.
You're inciting a fucking witch hunt, Justin. Anyone who doesn't use your preferred buzzword is a bigot who approves of anti-Muslim discrimination and must be exposed so they can be dealt with. Do you have any idea how that sounds to a powerless citizen of this country? Do you understand why some people might see that as a little bit threatening, as a little bit of an overreach on your part, you deranged maniac?
Fear is a dangerous thing. Once it is sanctioned by the state, there is no telling where it might lead. It is always a short path to walk from being suspicious of our fellow citizens to taking actions to restrict their liberty. Because if this room isn't a reflection of what's happening in our streets, in our towns, in our communities, then we're not dealing with the real things that Canadians expect us to deal with.
What does that even mean, Justin? It appears to have little to nothing to do with what you said previously. How exactly do you want the House of Commons to reflect what's happening in Canadian communities? You want to give the MPs signs and have them march around the House calling each other fascists, commies, and Islamophobes, or what? And why on earth do you think this is what Canadians want you to deal with? People voted for you because of the things they thought you'd actually do to improve their lives. Not because they thought you'd be dicking around with worthless virtue signaling like the government's a blue-haired college freshman. Oh, but don't let me interrupt your unhinged rant.
So, do we have a problem with Islamophobia in this country? Yes, we do.
Oh yes, we sure do. Islamophobia is one of the worst words to be invented in recent history. Its purpose is to damn dissenters and discourage the expression of sincerely held and often very valid opinions on the religion of Islam. Its structure is deeply flawed, and its meaning is malleable in the extreme, so that it can be presented as an innocuous term referring to real discrimination against a people 1 minute, and in the next minute referring to the informed critique of religious tenets or the actions of the religious in God's name. Its usage as a tool to shame anyone who speaks out in support of Islam's victims is becoming increasingly widespread, and now we have the very real problem that the current government of Canada has embraced all forms of Islamophobia. which includes the mere criticism of Islam.
In condemning all forms of Islamophobia.
And you, our Prime Minister, are currently ranting that all those who oppose the use of the term must be bigoted against Muslims as people and oppose the condemnation of discrimination against them, and they must be exposed and dealt with. Yeah, we have a very big problem with Islamophobia in this country, and I hope we realize it quick.
Do we have a problem with anti-Semitism in this country? Yes, we do.
Oh, hey, the Jews get a nod. Well, shit, that's more than you were willing to give them in the motion. You know, despite the vastly higher number of hate crimes against them. The Conservatives proposed adding them, since they're victims so much more often than anyone else, but you refused. Oh, and do you notice anything about the word anti-Semitism? I'll give you a second. Okay, that's a second. Semite refers to a people. Granted, a too broad group of people, but still people. Similarly to if you had a word anti-Muslimism, that would refer to people. If people criticize the violence in the Tanakh, or if Jews committed more terrorism in the name of their God than any other group on the planet, and people asked, hey, do you think their holy book might have something to do with that? And in response, people regularly went around calling those people Judaismophobes, they would sound totally foolish. And if the government then insisted that the word Judaismophobe must be used or you're a bigot who's contributing to hate crimes, I'd have to question the competence of my government.
Do we have a problem in this country with discrimination and hatred? Yes, we do.
What people love, like, dislike, or hate is none of your business, Justin. Your business is protecting people by dealing with the actions of other people. If you want to condemn actions done based on discrimination, like shootings and vandalism, or even people refusing to hire or do business with people based on their religion, then fine. Go nuts. But you've got no business talking like you're going to start hunting down people who have issues with your preferred terminology. You're the leader of a free Western nation. Start acting like it.
And we need to talk about this. And we need to challenge each other to be better on this.
Good, because that's what I'm doing right now.
We need to recognize that we still have a problem because there are men out there who will not say, yes, I am a feminist.
Really? Really? What on earth does this have to do with anything you've talked about so far? Oh, never mind. I know what it has to do with it. You define the citizens of this nation that you lead as good or evil depending on whether they use the words you like. It's got dick to do with what their opinions actually are. If you wanted to judge people based on their opinions, you'd have to actually listen to them. And you're far too important for that, aren't you? No, just give them the quick test. Hey, do you call yourself a feminist and do you call other people Islamophobes? No? Then this country has a problem with you.
We need to recognize that saying and bringing forward truths that are uncomfortable to some.
Truths like Islam needs to be criticized. Truths like Canada has very few hate crimes against anyone, let alone Muslims. Truths like Islamophobia is a deliberately divisive term with a wide variety of meanings, and the government's usage of it, especially with no accompanying definition, will not stop any hatred or division in Canadian communities, but just cause more. Truths like that.
And challenge each other to shift our ways of thinking out of the easy ways we do.
Easy ways, like asking someone if they like their buzzwords, and then if they don't, then using your power as Prime Minister to label them as problematic for society. Those kind of easy ways.
To lay open wounds to sunshine and disinfectant.
I don't even know what you mean by that. To lay open wounds? What? What does that mean? To talk about how crime is bad? Yeah, crime is bad. I guess that's a wound on the country, but you're not the sunshine that's going to disinfect it. The family and friends of the victims or the grieving would do that. Or maybe you mean you'll disinfect the wounds by talking about how hurt feelings are bad, or not liking specific ideas is bad, or opposing you in your effort to get everyone to use your stupid labels is bad. None of that lays open wounds to disinfectant. Do you seriously think the government is how the wounds of society are disinfected? Especially when all you're actually doing is creating wounds and then pouring dirt in them by dividing people up into two groups, good or problematic bigot, based on whether or not they use your favorite coded language and buzzwords to express themselves, and by insulting the people of your country and trying to cause fear of a scary boogeyman of widespread discrimination and hatred, and by pitting neighbors against neighbors by insisting that if there are people who disagree with your exact methods, Justin, they're bigots who need to be exposed and dealt with. No, Justin, your government, with M103 and all the rhetoric surrounding it, created the wounds.
That is also the role that we have in this House and that we have as active, engaged citizens in this country.
The only thing you've just said that's true is that it actually is your responsibility in that house to say truths that are uncomfortable to some. Unfortunately, you refuse to do that, and you appear to prefer lies and accusations.
We need to speak up. The silent majority of good people in Canada who are not intolerant, who are not bigoted, need to know they can be less silent.
The silent majority of good people who use the word Islamophobia and identify as feminists. And I guess everyone else in the country is the loud minority of bad people who are intolerant and bigoted. They're a basket of deplorables because they prefer clear terminology over political word games. Great. That's gonna win you lots of votes.
We need to speak up for the things we believe in.
That's what Canadians have been doing throughout this entire M103 debate, Justin. They're not just insincere bigots, they actually tell you the things they believe. And it's usually not, I hate all the Muslims. Not usually. But unfortunately, since a lot of us don't approve of the term Islamophobia, and we have some other issues with the wording of your motion, you've decided we're all bad, bigoted people who need to be exposed and dealt with because we promote division and fear. And the only good thing that's come from us speaking our mind is to show your side that you have more work to do if you want to accomplish all that. The first step of which, apparently, is to divide us up from the rest of society and promote fear of us. In effect, you've declared that you're not a leader who speaks for all the people of this country, but one whose goal is to create suspicion and hatred of your opponents. Ironically, because you're under the delusion that they want to do the same thing to others. Remember all those clips I played from 2 years ago, Justin? Look how fast you became everything you hate.
This house and every house across this country needs to be a reflection of that. And I know with the voices that we've heard today in this house, not only is today in good hands, but our future collectively is in very, very good hands. Merci beaucoup tout le monde. Thank you very, very much.
Fuck you. All I can do after hearing that is hope your hypocrisy ends somewhere. Preferably before you become a hypocrite regarding these statements, too.
It is, of course, not the first time the most illiberal of ends has been packaged in the language of liberation. Those who would use the state's power to restrict women's religious freedom and freedom of expression indulge the very same repressive impulse they profess to condemn. Efforts of one group to restrict the liberty of another are so very dangerous to this country, especially when the agencies of the state are used to do it.